All right, today I'm going to offer a friendly, hopefully charitable critique of the Catholic doctrine of the Mass from a Protestant perspective. Now, I broach this topic with fear and trepidation because I know that Catholics will be quick to accuse me of misrepresenting them. My hope is sincerely not to misrepresent anyone. I hope that I represent you accurately. However, I'm open to learning. If anyone's a Catholic in the audience, leave me a comment if you feel that I've misrepresented the view. All right, so just to start with the Catholic claim. What is the Mass, according to Catholics? In the Mass is a true and propitiatory sacrifice in which the victim, Christ, is immolated and offered by the priest, acting in persona Christi, in the person of Christ, to the Father. Okay, I'm going to read that again, slowly. The Mass is a true and propitiatory sacrifice in which the victim, Christ, is immolated and offered by the priest, acting in persona Christi, to the Father. Now, no matter how I look at this, that does give me pause when I read that. That statement is quite shocking, and I think it raises my Protestant hackles, and I want to explain why. So first of all, let's just touch on some common ground. Both Catholics and Protestants, historically, have affirmed the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. This is not a debate about whether or not the Eucharist is in some real sense Christ's body and blood, although we might differ on the metaphysical details there. Both affirm, in principle, that Christ's sacrifice was once for all sufficient and unrepeatable. This is a statement from the Archic Anglican Catholic Dialogue. Christ's redeeming death and resurrection took place once and for all in history. There can be no repetition or addition to what was then accomplished once for all by Christ. Okay, great, we're in agreement. Both affirm that the Eucharist is a sacrifice of praise and thanksgiving, that we offer our thanks, we offer ourselves, we offer our own bodies as living sacrifices to receive Christ and be made more like him. We both affirm that Christ's merits are truly pleaded and applied to the faithful. The dispute is very narrowly about whether the priest's act itself is a propitiatory sacrifice, whether that claim is coherent and warranted. Okay, so I want to state my sort of central concern, how I'm coming at this. Consider the statement, Mary is God. It's a statement that Catholics and Protestants would both object to, right? Mary is God. Now imagine someone defending that by saying, well, you see, Mary participates in the divine nature, right? That's what 1 Peter says. She is one with God, right? So in a sense, Mary is God, in the theosis sense, I guess, in the sense that we all are God, right? And who more than Mary, right? But see, notice what's going on there. The language of participation and oneness can be used to defend almost anything. You could defend almost any language, any practice, using the language of participation and oneness if those aren't applied precisely. My central concern here is that Catholics seem to insist on using the very language that implies the thing that they deny, and they use language of participation and oneness to kind of paper it over. And they use those terms in a very equivocal or imprecise way. All right, that's my critique. So let me just spell out the dilemma. Oh, and a note on the term the Mass. The Mass is just another word for what you could call many terms. Holy Communion, the Eucharistic celebration, the Lord's Supper. I'm just going to use the term the Mass in this video. All right, here's the dilemma. Either the Mass is identical to the sacrifice on Calvary, to Jesus' sacrifice on Calvary, or it is not. Okay? If it is not identical, if it's related, it participates, it's one with it in a certain sense, but it's still a distinct act in a real way, then the act itself cannot be propitiatory. The act of the Mass itself cannot be propitiatory. It can only apply that which was propitiatory. Okay? If it is identical, if the Mass is identical to Christ's sacrifice on Calvary, then we border on, I think, just nonsense. In order for two acts to be identical, they have to be performed at the same time by the same person. So the Mass happening now has to literally also be happening in 33 AD. You have to understand the Mass as some kind of time travel. And the priest has to literally be Jesus. He is Jesus. He's not just acting in the place of Jesus, he is Jesus, right? I think this is absurd. The Catholic needs to be precise when they say the Mass participates in or is one with Calvary, because if they mean complete identity, complete identicalness, then I think that's absurd. Okay, so let me define propitiatory. So to be propitiatory, an act it means appeasing divine wrath or satisfying divine justice. It comes from the ancient Hebrew, sacrificial system, right? So we can understand propitiatory in the noun sense, right? It's a sacrifice whose completion won atonement in the past. It's past, it's finished, and it's the fruits of a past act applied in the present. So we could say Christ's body and blood, the noun sense, are a propitiatory sacrifice, and they are really present in the Eucharist. Protestants have no problem with that. We have no problem with that propitiatory sacrifice in the noun sense. But Catholics go a little bit further. They're saying the Mass is a propitiatory sacrifice in the verb sense. So it's a current act, currently satisfying divine justice. The priest is not merely applying Calvary, but truly offering it in a propitiatory sense. So either Calvary was insufficient, which they would deny, or the act of the priest actually is Calvary. It is identical to Calvary, which I just think is nonsense. Or the word propitiatory is sort of being used imprecisely and equivocally, and we should probably throw it out because it's confusing. Just like we don't want to say Mary is God. Even if I mean that in an Orthodox way, it's not a helpful thing to say. Okay, so I want to start with the sort of classic Protestant proof text here, Hebrews 10. The law is only a shadow of the good things that are coming, not the realities themselves. For this reason, it can never, by the same sacrifices repeated endlessly year after year, make perfect those who are drawing near to worship. Otherwise, would they not have been stopped being offered? For the worshippers would have been cleansed once for all, and would no longer have felt guilty for their sins. But those sacrifices are an annual reminder of sins. It is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. Skipping down, for he said, sacrifices and offerings, burnt offerings and sin offerings you did not desire, nor were you pleased with them, though they were offered in accordance with the law. Then he said, here I am, I have come to do your will. He sets aside the first to establish the second, and by that will we have been made holy through the sacrifice of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. Day after day, every priest stands and performs his religious duties. Again and again, he offers the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. But when this priest had offered for all time one sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God. And since that time, he waits for his enemies to be made a footstool. For by one sacrifice, he has made perfect forever those who are being made holy. The Holy Spirit also testifies about this, for he says, I'm skipping down, and where these have been forgiven, sacrifice for sins is no longer necessary. There's one sacrifice for sins, past tense, right? Completed. Notice the argument here, right? The priests, the Jewish priests, they stand continually. Notice they stand, the posture. Whereas Christ offered, past tense, and sat down at the right, sat down, finished, complete. Notice that? Not continual, like the priests, it's complete once for all. If the sacrifices could perfect the worshippers, they would have stopped being offered. So sufficient sacrifice implies cessation of sacrifice. Continued sacrifice implies insufficient sacrifice. This is the very logic of Hebrews. It's not about the type of sacrifice. No, the argument Hebrews is not making is, oh, you guys offered the wrong kind of sacrifices. You guys are offering bulls and goats. We offer Christ. And so we have the right kind of sacrifices, and ours are continual and yours are continual. No, theirs are continual. Ours are once for all ceased. Done. See the difference? So now the response here is going to be, well, each Mass is one with. It participates in Christ's sacrifice. There's that language of oneness and participation. And that's the equivocation I'm concerned about. Couldn't the Jews have just said the same thing to the author of Hebrews? Couldn't they have rushed, oh, well, our sacrifice participates in the once for all sacrifice of Christ in an outside of time sense, right? They could have used that same logic, and Hebrews is arguing against that, right? It's not that they just offer the wrong kind of sacrifice continually. It says the finished once for all nature of Christ's work renders continual propitiatory sacrifice incoherent. Also notice the analogy of high priest. You see that elsewhere in Hebrews. Christ is the lone high priest who goes into the Holy of Holies in the heavenly realms and offers alone, not him and all the other priests. That's not how the high priestly sacrifice worked. The priests did not go in with all the other priests and together co-offer the sacrifice, right? And the logic of Hebrews is that Christ alone is worthy to enter, right? He alone is worthy to enter, right? So again, a multiplicity of priests undermines this. The Catholic might just say that Christ's act is eternal. So we have in Revelation, the lamb standing as though slain. You have the lamb slain before the foundation of the world. So there's a sense in which, Christ's act is eternal in time, not just one act in time. And so we can say the masses. Again, I would just point out that Hebrews is using past tense verbs. Completed. He sat down, right? He offered, past tense. Right? And it condemns the Jews precisely for their repeated acts. I would ask why the Jews could not have just used the same reasoning to defend their sacrifices. There may be a sense in which God's eternal perspective, from God's eternal view, Christ's act is eternal and timeless. I understand that. But in time, when we're talking about in time, it's a distinct act that happened at one point in time. And the Catholic wants to kind of leverage God's eternal timeless perspective to now say that, well, it's fine if all these distinct acts which happen at different points in time, are somehow one. I mean, it just sort of waters down the meaning of it. Like if Christ's act is always happening, if Christ's propitiatory act, then why do we need the Mass at all? Why do we need it, right? It's always happening. It's happening now. It's happening everywhere, right? It's eternal. It's outside of time and space, right? Okay, well, the Mass makes it present at one moment. It like helps us participate in the sense of receiving. Okay, fine, but that's just the Protestant view, right? Okay, moving on. In persona Christi. In persona Christi. So now Catholics are going to want to say the priest acts in the person of Christ, in persona Christi, in offering the Mass. So it's not a distinct act. It's the same act of Calvary, and it's Christ acting through the priest. Okay, but here we're going to have the same problem. So it seems that the Catholic is saying it's one offering. The Mass is one offering with Christ's sacrifice because the priest simply is, in some sense, Christ. He is Jesus. Very strange. I want to ask this. Could Christ have granted sacramental power to someone else, say Peter, and acted through him to die on the cross in his stead? Hey, Peter, go die on the cross for me. Go in persona Christi, die on the cross for me. I'm going to be acting through you. Don't worry about it. You do it for me. Could he have done that? No, of course not. We all would disagree with that, right? A representative acting in persona Christi, however we want to flesh that out, cannot offer up once for all the sacrifice on Calvary, cannot die on the cross. Only the God-man can do that. And we understand this, we accept this. And so this needs to cement our understanding that whatever is happening in the Mass, it is distinct from the act which Christ accomplished on Calvary, which only he uniquely could do. No amount of sacramental or in persona Christi language can make it such that another human being, not the God-man, could have died on the cross for us. And so no one can offer up the once for all sacrifice of Christ, right? Yeah. So if we just say it's just Christ acting through the priest, if that's what we mean by in persona Christi, then it's not the priest's actions in the Mass, which are propitiatory. It's purely passive. There's no upward direction, only a downward receptive direction. He is not offering a sacrifice in any meaningful sense. He is purely passive. So this is just collapse to the Protestant view. I just don't see how that's a real the act of the priest is a propitiatory sacrifice. That just doesn't seem coherent. If instead the Catholic says that in that moment, in the moment of the Mass, the priest just is Jesus. He is Jesus. That just seems to border on nonsense. We're seeing this, again, I'm pressing on this idea of language, like saying Mary is God, and then using all kinds of language of participation and oneness to defend it, right? Just drop the problematic language if that's not what you mean. Immolation. So I want to talk about immolation. Immolation means the destruction of the victim. Catholics say not just that Christ was immolated, past tense, or that he is represented as having been immolated, but that he is truly immolated in the Mass. How do I make sense of this, right? Either the immolation in the Mass, so they might say, well, it's outside of time and it's identical to the immolation on Calvary. It's not a distinct immolation. Okay, if the immolation in the Mass is identical to Calvary, it's either identical to Calvary or it's a distinct act. If it's identical, we just have absurdity. When was Christ killed? When? How many times? Once. When? In 33 AD. What about now? Is he being killed now? Well, who is he killed by? Well, the Jews, the Romans. Okay, what about by all the Catholic priests? Are they killing him? No. Okay. If the Mass is identical to Calvary, we just get nonsense and absurdity. If it's a distinct act, and we insist on saying that distinct act is an immolation of Christ, then we have repetition. He is immolated over and over and over again, which Catholics will deny. And we're back to the Protestant view. All right, moving on to the Church Fathers. So a Catholic might think here, well, look, you Protestants, you can have your objections, but all the Church Fathers agree with us. I just have not found that to be the case. The Church Fathers consistently teach that the Mass is a sacrifice, but the question is what kind of sacrifice? So I'll be quick to admit, Cyprian is the one Church Father that really does seem to take the Catholic side. Right? I'll post the full quote here, but basically he's getting at the point that, the Church offers the full sacrifice to the Father. It's this in persona Christi language. Very Catholic. I'll grant them. I'll give you Cyprian. But he's mid-3rd century, so not the earliest witness. So now Irenaeus says something different. He says that the Church's sacrifices are like the sacrifice of Abel, offering the first fruits of earth. Here's a direct quote. For it behooves us to make an oblation, a sacrifice to God, and in all things to be found grateful to God our Maker, and in a pure mind, and in faith without hypocrisy, in well-grounded hope, in fervent love, offering the first fruits of his own created things. And the Church alone offers this pure oblation to the Creator, offering to him, with the giving of thanks, things taken from his creation. So in Irenaeus, what are we offering? We're offering the earthly elements, the bread and the wine, and we're receiving down from heaven a union of the heavenly and the earthly elements. That's what he talks about, this union of heavenly and earthly elements, a union of the bread in Christ's body, a union of the wine in Christ's blood. So what we're offering is the earthly elements, not Christ's body and blood, and we were receiving from heaven Christ's body and blood. That's the Protestant view. Protestants have no objection to this. Here's John Chrysostom. John Chrysostom is a little bit ambiguous, and he seems to go back and forth even in this very passage. He's addressing Hebrews, by the way. Very interesting. He seems to correct himself, right? So here's the full passage. You can pause and read it. But he's saying two things sort of back and forth. He's saying that the sacrifice of the Mass is one and the same as the sacrifice of Christ. So it sounds Catholic. But then he's also saying, well, it's a figure and a remembrance of that sacrifice. So now he's making a distinction, not identity. It's not identical. They're different. One is a remembrance, a figure, a representation of that sacrifice. Okay. And at the end, he seems to just correct himself. So he says, we offer the same. So we offer the same as Christ did, or more precisely, we perform a remembrance of a sacrifice. So he's making a distinction between the Mass and Calvary, reminiscent of the Protestant position. They're different. They're not identical. Okay. So I'll let you parse that one out. And again, he is going back and forth. It seems odd, but I'll leave that to you to decide. So Augustine, City of God, speaks of the Eucharist as a sacrifice in the sense of the sacrifice of the church's self-offering to God. We offer ourselves to God as living sacrifices to be made more like Christ, to receive him and be more like Christ. Protestants have no objection to this. This is not the Catholic propitiatory view. Other early witnesses like the Didache and Justin Martyr speak of the Eucharist as a sacrifice of thanksgiving. Again, nothing that Protestants can't affirm. So I would say the witness of the church fathers is ambiguous. There's some church fathers like Cyprian that Catholics can strongly appeal to, but I would say there are others that Protestants can appeal to. Temporal punishment. So now, in addition to this sort of idea of the sacrifice of the Mass being one with, what does that mean? One with Calvary. Catholics also believe that the priest, by his own intention, can offer their Mass to remit the temporal punishment of someone in purgatory. So what's interesting to me is historically, when Protestants challenged the propitiatory nature of the Mass, Catholics tend to lean on the Mass's nature as remitting temporal punishment. That's why it's propitiatory. That was their explanation. Although modern Catholics tend to downplay this and focus on its oneness with Calvary, and that's why it's propitiatory. So very different kinds of arguments. Protestants obviously are going to reject the notion of temporal punishment and the whole system of, indulgences in purgatory and all the rest that goes along with it. And you can say, okay, well then, you don't have a valid Eucharist because you reject this. Well, guess what? The Eastern churches, the Oriental and Orthodox churches, also reject the notion of temporal punishment. So if the Catholic denies the validity of Protestant Eucharists on that basis, then they also have to deny the validity of Eastern Eucharists, which Catholics have always affirmed. So the Easterners have valid Eucharist, even though they deny the reality of temporal punishment. Okay, then there's no problem with the Protestants. I want to mention the Eastern view briefly, because it's worth touching on. What does the East think about all this? So the Eastern churches have a very strong sense of Eucharistic sacrifice and use that language. But I want to note and point out that, again, the question is, in what sense? They reject the notion of a propitiatory sacrifice in the sense of satisfying divine justice, because they just have a less juridical understanding of salvation. They don't see salvation so much in terms of like satisfying justice or satisfying wrath. They see it more in terms of healing and restoration, these kinds of things. So to them, what they mean when they say Eucharistic sacrifice, they understand it in terms of enacting the presence of the kingdom on earth, uniting the church to Christ's eternal self-offering, and participating in the heavenly liturgy. Those are all things which Protestants can affirm, right? There's no problem with any of that. We have no problem with speaking of the Eucharist as a sacrifice in that sense. So in summary, propitiatory in the Catholic sense is used equivocally. And when you press on what it means, it either collapses into what Protestants already affirm, and it's just a very, very confusing way of saying things, or else it implies a repetition of Calvary, right? The in persona Christi language cannot transfer the ontological uniqueness that made Christ's sacrifice efficacious. You can't just use in persona Christi as a magic word to mean that the priest can now do things that only Christ can do. Or else we would have to say that, Christ could have sent Peter in persona Christi to go die on the cross for him. The Hebrews logic is that sufficient sacrifice implies cessation. It applies to the Mass as much as to the Old Testament sacrifice, and that Catholics' participation in the eternal sacrifice escapes this very argument that Hebrews is written to refute. I would just note here, think of the night our Lord died, right? I know the Catholics are going to want to keep saying, oh, well, the Mass is one with, and maybe they would even say it's identical to the sacrifice on Calvary. I just want to show you why that cannot be the case. On the night Christ died, on the night he was betrayed, could he have just said, this is my body, this is my blood, all right, done. I just did it. I just offered the once for all sacrifice for sins. I don't need to go to the cross now. I just did it. Right there. You just saw me. Bread and wine. I said the words. That's it. No. Of course he couldn't have said that. We understand that his doing that, it's a representation. It's one with, in a certain sense, it participates in a certain sense, his future sacrifice on Calvary. It's not identical to it. If it is identical to his act on Calvary, then he wouldn't have needed to go to the cross after that. He would have been done. There's a distinction. It has to be different. And Catholics are trying to collapse the two as if they're the same. The Mass, the Eucharist, is distinct from, it's not identical to Calvary. This is, again, this is such a simple point, but I don't know why it's so hard. And using language of participation and oneness very imprecisely does not solve the problem. It just obfuscates it. Yeah, I'd say a lot of the same things. The language of immolation is deeply misleading. The Mass as a present tense verb is an immolation of Christ. I mean, that, again, either the Mass is identical to Calvary or it isn't, right? And if it is, we have nonsense. If it's not, we have deeply problematic theology, right? The patristic evidence, I think, is genuinely mixed. And the specific Tridentine formulation appears to be, it's not as clear early on. It's a later development. If the Catholic wants to lean on the purgatorial propitiation account of the Mass, and if that's essential to its validity, that would render Eastern Eucharist equally invalid. So that's a conclusion that Rome can't accept. And then the Eastern churches demonstrate that a fully sacrificial understanding of the Eucharist is possible without the specific propitiatory Tridentine category, suggesting that those categories are, a Catholic scholastic development rather than the universal teaching of the church. So there's my critique. I hope it was charitable. I hope I did not misrepresent anyone. Let me know what you guys think in the comments.